from Jerusalem and welcome to Beit Avichai. We're beginning today a new series here from the center of Jerusalem about the development of this modern city, how it was influenced during different historical periods and went through urban changes. The series will be led by Dr. Marik Shtern, head of Urbanism, Space and Society Studies at the SCE Native School of Architecture and also an associate lecturer at Hebrew University here in Jerusalem. Dr. Shtern is a researcher of political geography of divided cities, among them Jerusalem. His areas of expertise include interaction between religion, civil society, and local politics. We will begin this first out of 4 sessions in the Ottoman period. Bevakasha, Marik.
Hi. Thank you everyone for joining us. So I'll first say a few words about the course in general, Discovering Jerusalem, Social History, Urbanism, and Geopolitics. The idea behind this course is to allow you, people who live in here or visit Jerusalem, to understand how did we get to this point of contemporary Jerusalem. And we'll be discussing Jerusalem through the modern period. Beginning at the 19th century, the first session will be devoted today to the late Ottoman period. Later on, the second session, we will discuss the British Mandate period, 1917 up to 1948. The third class will be devoted to the early Israeli period, 1948 up to the end of the 80s. Of course, this part of history includes also the division of the city between Israel and Jordan. And the last class will discuss contemporary Jerusalem, which I call post-Oslo Jerusalem, a city which is more characterized by conflict and growing tensions among its population, but also a change in geography. So, without further ado, I would like to start with the first period, the late Ottoman period, which is a very special period, I think, in my opinion. We used to, when we learn about this period in schools in Israel, in geography classes and etc., the main theme usually was, it was a poor Ottoman city. Until the British authorities came, nothing really worked in there. It was a primitive space, Middle Eastern and etc. But latest studies show that actually we can see at the end of the Ottoman period many signs of modernization, the insurgence of first signs of nationality, and also a bit of urban planning and impressive urban development. So let's start but with the beginning. What happened in the middle of the 19th century that created suddenly great changes in the landscape of Jerusalem, the social landscape, the political landscape, and etc. I want to show you a very famous map drawn in 1581 by Heinrich Buntig. Heinrich Buntig was a Protestant scholar and also a cartographer. And he had this illustration on Jerusalem that represent in many ways the idea that Jerusalem is not only a city, but a sort of the central point of the known world at that time. You can already see in the map that there are 3 known continents, right? Europa, Asia, and Africa, but also a first indication of America at the lower side of the map. But still, in spite of the fact that they know that America exists, Buntig prefers to present the world as a whole, as a very symmetric map. And of course, it's not a physical geographical map. It's what we call a mental, I would say, mystical map of the world. And what I would like to say that through this map we can understand a very particular role that Jerusalem has among the Abrahamic religions. Jerusalem is not only a historical city where the prophets and King of David and Solomon etc. walks, but it also have a very important role in the mystical map of believers, especially of the 3 monotheistic religions. So Jerusalem, at this map, is the axis mundi, meaning it's the center point of the world, a point which is usually on top of a mountain. We have several axis mundis in the world that you can relate to, also in India and South America, but for the monotheistic religions, Jerusalem serves for this part. What does it mean to be the axis mundi? It means that when you, a believer, come to Jerusalem, whether you're Jewish or Christian, and also in some ways Muslim, Jerusalem for you is a portal gate for the world that above us, meaning the heavens, but also for the world that below us, hell, in fact. So it's a portal between the physical world and the immaterial, the metaphysic world. This is why, for example, when we go to the Kotel, the Western Wall, we as Jews, we put a small note, because this is the place where you can actually meet God, right? So this idea reflects. But also when we see in the traditions of all religions, Jerusalem has a very particular role in the creation of the world. For example, the foundation stone that is below the Dome of the Rock, according to the Jewish tradition, that is the first rock of which the world developed, right? The first rock upon the earth. Also, when we go around Jerusalem, the old city, you get to the Holy Sepulchre, where allegedly Jesus was crucified, and below the hill of crucifixion, the Golgotha, the believers say that the skull of Adam, the first man of earth, is there. So again, we see this relation to the creation of the world, but more significantly, Jerusalem is also the place where the world will end, right? This is the place where the Messiah will reappear, and the believers from all around the world will gather at the end of times. And in that way, we can already understand the huge, I would say, weight that Jerusalem has in the minds of people, especially believers. And this is what made Jerusalem a very important token in the conquers of many empires around the world. Another thing that we can see in this map is, again, this unique geographical position of Jerusalem between ancient civilizations. For example, we can see that this is the crossing road between the Eastern civilization, India, the Silk Road, and etc., the European civilization, Rome, Greece, Africa, the Egyptian civilization. On top of it also we can talk of Little Asia. But it's important to note that Jerusalem never served as the capital of any one of these empires. It was always in the margins, in between. A place where you want to hold it, but not necessarily rule from it. So our story of modern Jerusalem begins at the middle of the 19th century, and this is a very early modern map of Jerusalem, the plan of the town and environs of Jerusalem from 1841, made by the Royal Engineers in Syria, meaning these are British cartographers that came to Jerusalem the first time, actually measured exactly the distances between places and made a very concise cartography of the city. What did we have in Jerusalem at that point of time? We know that it was really a remote and secondary place in the Ottoman Empire. For example, Jerusalem was attached to the Damascus district. It didn't even have a district of its own. It wasn't a capital of any regional district. That really indicates the lack of importance at that point of time of Jerusalem to the Ottoman Empire. We know that in 1838, we had around 11,000 people living in Jerusalem. A very big village, but you can't compare Jerusalem to any major city in Europe or even in Asia at that time. Among this 11,000 population, you had 3,000 Jews, 4,500 Muslims, and 3,500 Christians. We can say that it's quite a comparable or equal split, third between three religions. Jerusalem was a holy city, and most of the people who lived there were belonging to one of those sects. So you had a lot of clergies and many religious institutions in the city. Right? And especially, the city was organized and condensed within the Ottoman city walls built in the 16th century. Another important thing that we have to understand about the history of Jerusalem, that we can't explain the importance of Jerusalem by its geography, because Jerusalem is not situated in any major historical road. It's not near a port, and even the source of water in Jerusalem, the Gihon spring, is quite small. And when the city grew, the rulers of the city, for example, for the Second Temple period, like Herods and etc., had to bring water from external sources. So Jerusalem became important despite its lack of any natural advances. We can explain the importance of Jerusalem by the fact that it was always a religious center, a regional religious center. And I'm giving this introduction just to understand that when modernism comes to Jerusalem, later on also secular thought, nationalism, and etc., it comes to a very ancient religious space. Here we see a lithograph of Damascus Gate. When the Ottomans built these walls around Jerusalem at the 16th century, the front gate of Jerusalem, the important gate of Jerusalem, was this one. This is also the most beautiful gate among the other gates of the city. Damascus Gate confronts the northern side of the city. If we come back to this map, this is where Damascus Gate is, and you see also topographically that this is the easier access to the city. On the other sides of Jerusalem, there are valleys. And coming back to this picture, we see this orientalistic picture of Arab men with camels and etc. And Jerusalem did resemble what we call the classical Muslim city. What does it mean, a classical Muslim city? That, for example, you can see a dominance of men in public space. Women would normally be segregated in their own neighborhoods, streets, and would not walk easily on the everyday life around the public spaces. Another characteristic of the city would be the division into ethnic religious enclaves. You have some mixed space, but mostly you have separate harats, meaning neighborhoods, for Jews, Muslims, Christians, and of course there is a subdivision between that to different Christian sects, different Muslim groups, and etc. But that is a highly characteristic to the Muslim city. Another thing is that Jerusalem originally was rebuilt by the Roman Empire at the 2nd century as a polis. What does it mean? It was rebuilt with a straight grid of west-east streets and north-east axes with very wide avenues in the middle. This was not very adaptable to the weather, which is, as you can see in the picture, on the verge of the desert. And with the years, we saw that the wide alleys became more and more dense, and the grid system became more of cul-de-sac alleys, which resembles an adaptation of this structure to the environment of the desert, but also to the social conditions of the Muslim Arab populations. The cul-de-sac alleys create opportunity for a private public space, which no one will go through, only the family members or visitors that have been invited. As a Muslim city, it was also ruled by a religious time, right? The muazzin, the voice of the muazzin calling for the prayer, will dominate this landscape. This is how people knew approximately what is the time of the day. But each religion had its own, I would say, temporal calendar. Of course, the synagogue coming 3 times a day to prayer, and also the Christians would ring the bells, although in most cases they weren't allowed to ring the bells. Later on, they became more dominant. And the last thing that is important to note is that there was a clear political hierarchy at that time between the different religions. The Ottomans were Muslims, and the Ottoman, I would say, citizens would be at the top of the political ladder, and then other Muslims, the local Palestinian Muslims, we will say, lower would be the Christian population, and at the bottom the Jewish population. But even within each religion section, you had an inner stratification. For example, the Ottomans and the Muslims in general in this region preferred the Eastern Orthodox churches and were always fighting against the presence of the European, the Catholic or Frank churches within this space. It took the intervention of the political power of the Europeans at the middle of the 19th century to allow the reconstruction of new European monasteries, I would say, Catholic and etc. But also within the Jewish population, you had an hierarchy in which the Sephardic Jews were a bit higher than the Ashkenazi Jews. They spoke fluently Arabic, they were sometimes citizens of the empire, and etc. So that was a very strict hierarchy, and within this understandable of the hierarchy, there was a sort of coexistence between the populations. But things do happen in the middle of the 19th century that start change rapidly the landscape of Jerusalem. Most significantly is the Crimean War. You see in this drawing the attack on the Malakov, a famous battle between the French forces and the Russian. What does that have to do with Jerusalem? So what happened was that the Ottoman Empire, which was diminishing its power throughout the 19th century, had to ask the aid of Western forces, Western allies, most significantly Britain and France, to aid it with its territorial wars against Russia, especially around the Black Sea. And especially in the Crimean War, the British Navy came and kind of helped the Ottomans, but they wanted something in return. And what they received in return, and also other European powers, were privileges in Palestine and especially in Jerusalem. If you were a European citizen in the 19th century in Jerusalem, you had a protected status. If you committed a crime, you would go to the consulate. You wouldn't go to the Ottoman courts, and etc. And that was the arrangement between the Ottomans and the European, but it allowed, especially after the Crimean War, for the European forces to come and build and reinforce their presence within Jerusalem. From 1839 until 1876, the Ottoman Empire also conducts a series of reforms called Tanzimat. The reforms were articulated in order to enhance the modernization of the Ottoman Empire and kind of a last try of saving its status. What is important for us, those reforms covered a lot of areas, from the army, the financial system, communication, but what is important for Jerusalem are property rights. From the middle of the 19th century and on, for the first time, non-Muslim residents could buy property in Jerusalem and could build their own houses. That created, from the middle of this century, a new landscape in Jerusalem. This is one of the examples. This is Christ Church, an Anglican Protestant church in Jerusalem that was built in 1840 and created the first, I would say, Protestant compound within the old city. This was actually a compound which included a church, the residence of the British consul, and also a hospital. And it does resemble the way that the foreign empires involved themselves within Jerusalem. For example, that was the first non-Orthodox church built in Jerusalem since the Crusaders. But you can see that it still doesn't have a bell tower. That was a sign of domination of the Muslims around them. You can have a church, but bells might be a little bit too much. Another area that resembles this development is the Russian court. The Russians are building in 1864 a small city for themselves outside of the city gates of Jerusalem. And this is a city for the pilgrims. The biggest group of pilgrims in Jerusalem in the 19th century are Russian pilgrims. And for the Russian church and also the Russian Tsar, the pilgrims are, I would say, they're foot soldiers in Jerusalem. Through the pilgrims, they create their presence. But these pilgrims didn't have anywhere to sleep. The existing institutions were not allowed enough for them. So they built a pilgrim city, which include, I would say, small hotels for the rich pilgrims and the poor pilgrims, separate residence for women and men, a small hospital, a shop, and of course, a church. Okay. So Jerusalem landscape is changing rapidly, but I think that the most significant development that we should relate to is the development of transportation. And up until 1860, to get to Jerusalem, you had to take a very long trip from Jaffa, for example, of a day and a half, in which you stop overnight in Ramla and then change from carriage to something like a donkey or a horse in the Bab el-Wad, and then you go up a very steep and narrow road, a road which was very difficult for many people, especially if you're an old person or a sick person, and etc. So it did create a very large challenge on creating any kind of visitor flow into Jerusalem. In 1860, the Ottomans for the first time are paving the road to Jerusalem, which has an immense effect. From now on, you can go to Jerusalem from Jaffa in 6 hours. That means, and in a carriage, which is much more convenient. That, in fact, opens the way for tourism to come to Jerusalem. At the same time, in 1850, approximately, we already have steamboats, which allows tourists to come in much faster and safer way to this region. This is the time where global tourism is developing. It's not only a habit of aristocratic small groups, but also the growing middle class can now join and travel abroad with those new technologies. Maybe the most significant development is the creation of the railroad to Jerusalem from Jaffa. This was actually the first railway built in the Middle East. This short way between Jaffa and Jerusalem, which also indicates kind of the growing importance of the city within the Ottoman thought. What happened in this railroad station, that actually the travel to Jerusalem was not shortened so much. It was already also around 6 hours, but going in a railway, it's much more easy, and it creates this sense of modernization and development. The Jerusalemites were very proud with the creation of this railway and rail station to Jerusalem. Sorry. And all these developments, which I just indicated, the new pavement of the road from Jaffa to Jerusalem, the railway, and etc., shifts the center of balance to Jaffa Gate. We talked before about the importance of Damascus Gate, right? The gate that goes to the north, to Nablus, Shechem in Hebrew, to inner land. But Jaffa, suddenly, the gate that turns to the west became the focal point of the new Jerusalem. In fact, this was the central station then of carriages of the city. And also, if you would come from the railway, this would be the gate that you first come to from the south of Jerusalem. And once you have a central station in such a location, you already have many other developments that accompany such development. So, for example, hotels, restaurants, bars, photography shops, post offices, of course. Later on, when the Ottomans realized that there is a new city developing outside Jaffa Gate, they also opened the municipality house within this area and a public theater. And that was, in fact, the first city center of Jerusalem, an Ottoman city center, which has very particular and interesting characteristics. First of all, it was very much cosmopolitan. It was a mixed space for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And you could see how each group kind of owns a different sector of the business in these districts. So for example, the Templars, the German Templars, were known of creating the first pubs because they drink beers, and they brought this industry to Jerusalem, but also hotel. The first fast hotel, where we can see in the picture, was owned by Templars. The Greeks and the Armenians controlled the market of photography. Jewish commercial businesses include clothing and some banking and etc. And a new city center were developing in Jaffa Road, starting from Jaffa Gate. This is a picture of the Fast Hotel in 1903. Fast Hotel were built a bit farther away from Jaffa Gate, but not very too far away. And that was the first luxurious hotel in Jerusalem. We can actually see here a group of tourists performing their stands with horses or donkeys in front of the camera. So if you are an upper middle class tourist, you can come to Jerusalem now. You have a convenient place to be in the Fast Hotel. You have restaurants, you have banks, you have everything you need basically to travel around Jerusalem. And we can understand this shift by the idea that this Jaffa Gate, which turns to the west and goes to Jaffa, resembles the westernization of the landscape of Jerusalem, from Damascus Gate to Jaffa Gate. And in this picture, which is the front picture of the course in general, but I wanted to come back here, you see this Jaffa Road leading to Jaffa Gate. So yeah, it doesn't look like a modern European big city. It's still a bit rural and small scale, but for the Jerusalemite, that was modernity for them. And you can see in some of the shops the photos, right? The Krikorian, which was also an Armenian photographer, and etc. So it's a mixed space, a cosmopolitan space, but still we need to remember this is the Ottoman Empire. Even though some of the reforms in the Ottoman Empire indicated that from now on all citizens should have equal rights, there were still these hierarchies between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And for example, the city council, which was not elected, would always have a large majority of Muslim councilmen and a small representation for Christians and Jews selected from the local community. Going back to Jaffa Gate, in 1907, the city residents from all sects are collecting money to build a clock tower. And this is the period of time in which the Ottoman Empire is fostering local residents, encouraging them to build those kind of clock towers in every major city. We have in Jaffa, in Haifa, we have the same ones, also in Nablus and in other places. And the clock is the introduction of the normal time into Jerusalem. Think about it. People did not have watches. This was their watch, and now they can actually set a meeting and come to the meeting in a precise time. The productivity of work can be much more efficient. And the clock watch also indicated the time in other cities in the empire. So it was an attempt also to recreate this Ottoman identity of which the residents can be proud of. And for some period of time at the beginning of the 20th century, the idea of Ottomanism, the idea that, for example, Jews can come to Palestine and create their own communities under the Ottoman Empire as equal citizens, that was one of the ideas that even David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi relived in at the beginning of the 19th century, but coming to the First World War, those ideas kind of collapsed with the reality. So of course, not only Jaffa Road developed in this period, but you see a mass of new construction all around the old city, but mostly to the north and to the west. There is a major development of Christian religious institutions, a welfare and charity institution. For example, at the top here, you can see the Talita Kumi Orphan House, which was a German institution with girl orphans coming mostly from the Arab local community. There are many orphanages, houses in Jerusalem. In fact, it was known that if you are an orphan at the beginning of the 20th century, anywhere in the Ottoman Empire, people send you to Jerusalem because there are many orphan houses in the city. And of course, the different groups were competing between them who would create a more popular institution, because once you are an Arab girl, let's say for example, and you go to Talita Kumi as an orphan, at the end of the process when you're 18, you are already a Lutheran Christian, for example. So it also a sort of a mission, this kind of institution. And of course we can talk about hospitals that every large European power built in the city as another source of influence on the local communities. So we have this inner competition between the European states on the landscape of Jerusalem and on its rather small population, which grew rapidly at the end of the 19th century. In the middle, we see the famous tower of Yemin Moshe, Mishkenot Sha'ananim neighborhood, the known first Jewish neighborhood built outside the city gates in 1860. This is the site of this neighborhood. Jews had a very particular way of constructing their own neighborhoods outside the city walls. It was usually a very organized project. You had a group of people, normally from the same kind of ethnic origin, Moroccan Jews or Ashkenazi religious Jews from Warsaw, or even, subdivisions within this community, the Kurds and etc. And they were organizing, collecting money, and building a small neighborhood from themselves. If we compare it to Arab development, which was much more individualized and not organized, like those private houses that are on Shlom Tzion Amalka Street today. This is already a map of Jerusalem at the end of the 19th century, and we can see already how much the development outside the city walls became even wider than the old city itself. What we can see is that the major development, as I said, is along the Jaffa Road. Jaffa Road is this is the line of Jaffa Road. Most of the neighborhoods along this road on both sides were Jewish neighborhoods. The Muslim population mostly built this scattered housing at the northern side of the old city, and there are also Abu Tor, and below the map you can see Baka and etc. And this is where the Templars, the Christian Templars, built their own neighborhood. So we can actually see that the pattern of neighboring or residency that took place within the old city recreated again outside the old city along these small enclaves of cultural ethnic identities. If we talk about Jewish neighborhoods, the most dominant structure of a Jewish neighborhood at the end of 19th century would be the courtyard neighborhoods. First of all, we have to remember that living outside the city walls at that time were considered a dangerous thing. The city walls were safeguarding the people living within them, and until the middle of the 19th century, the Ottomans even shut off the gates. If you came after sunset, you have to sleep outside the gate and wait for the morning, because they didn't want any kind of robbers or gangs to come and interrupt the lives of people inside. When you go and live outside, you don't have this privilege. So the courtyard were actually built around this idea of creating a safe space. So for example, as we can see it, the entrances to the houses in this courtyard are inside the yard. You have to go through a gate and then through the yard enter your house, and around the outer side of the house is mostly windows, but you would rarely find a door opening to that side. This construction is not only about safety, but actually it also corresponds to the religious character of residents in this neighborhood. Because when you live in a courtyard resident like this is another example, Knesset Israel on Bezalel Street today, it creates a space in which everyone, and here we see the inner yard and the balconies, even the balconies are not confronting the street like we think about balconies, but are confronting the yard itself. But then you can have a kind of a social control of people inside, especially when we talk about ultra-religious communities. You can see everyone when they come back from home, who they bring to their houses, what are they still keeping, the Shabbat inside. You can't really violate any law when you live within those compounds. This is another map of small units of neighborhood. When we talk about a Jewish neighborhood, as I showed you, it can be only 10 up to 20 houses in general. But again, each one have a particular identity. This is Jaffa Road, for those of you who don't read Hebrew. And we see here neighborhoods like Machne Yehuda in purple, Sharei Tzedek, Ruchama, each one built in a bit of a different period. And we actually, if you go to this right side neighborhood, Zichron Moshe, this is already the first neighborhood built in Jerusalem at 1903, not according to the typology of the courtyard, but along the idea of private houses, but still very dense and close to each other. But that is already a development from the courtyard to something that resembles a modern middle class neighborhood. The Arabs, as I said, when they left the old city, it was usually the more affluent members of the society building those villas for themselves, a multi-generational house usually, in which the kids can come and live in the upper floor, and also the grandchildren, and everybody lives together. But this is the neighborhood of Musrara, but again, Musrara was built organically. It wasn't an initiative. They had no cooperation or a code or inner code of living, but they did it, friends going outside and building their own house around each other. A very famous villa is Al Husseini Villa on the road to Mount Scopus, which was a site of many parties and social gatherings during the British Mandate. But again, a typology of Arab expansion outside the city walls. There is also a poor population within the Muslim population of Jerusalem. Many of them are living in small villages attached to the city, like this Silwan village near Jerusalem, and we can see the poverty, the marginality, especially when you compare it to the villas that I just showed you. And of course, there is a large, more poorer population within the city walls in the Muslim quarter. A very important development in the landscape of Jerusalem is the acquisition of lands by the Christian Orthodox Greek Church. From the middle of the 19th century, once the Ottoman reforms allows to non-Muslim residents to purchase land in the empire and also in Palestine, we see that this church is buying a lot of lands around the old city, especially to the west side of the city. This is a viewpoint towards west, so if I'll try to indicate where is the where are those properties that would be outside in this side. What did the Greek Orthodox Church do with all this property? Mostly it planted agricultural products like olives, grapes, and also trees for silk, berry trees. Agricultural, a type of agriculture that they know from their origin in the Greek island. But that in many ways created a challenge for the development of Jerusalem. If I'll come back to the map that I showed you before, all this chunk of land to the west of the old city belonged to the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, full of olive trees that you can still find in this way. Today in this area we can find Rechavia, Talbieh, Katamon, the Bell Park, and etc. Why did they buy this land? Because first of all, because they had money, they had a connection to buy this large amount of land, but also we need to think through the mental state of a church, right? They buy land in the Holy City for generations, right? It's a privilege to own this amount of land around the city, and maybe in the future, 100 years later, they can sell some of it if they needed the cash, but they kept it. And this also created a situation in which most of the development is going northwards or southwards and not to the west. This situation has changed dramatically after the World War I, and I will relate to that in our next class. Another interesting development, we talked a bit until now about the Jewish neighborhoods and the Muslim neighborhoods, but Jerusalem also attracted communities from other parts of the world, and maybe the most notable and known example are the German Templars. The Templars are coming from South Germany. They're a small sect within the Lutheran Church. And they believe that they need to come and settle in the Holy Land, live their life as farmers, basically. That was the idea, and create this example of the right type of life upon the people living around them. They come and they buy in South Jerusalem lands that belong to Beit village. If you know a bit of Jerusalem, this is Emek Rephaim Street, and this is Bethlehem Street, and both in between them we see the beginnings of the German colony. It was a very unique, I would say, community that lived in Jerusalem for almost 70 years. Around 3 generations of Templars. They built their houses exactly the way that they used to have their own houses in Bavaria, and farmers' houses. Usually in the cellar you have a room for agricultural products and maybe a donkey or two. The family lived in the first floor, and sometimes they also built in upper floors for renting. Of course, the next generation of the Templars, let's say if the first generation comes in 1870 and really devotes its life to farming, agriculture, and etc., then second generation already were less interested in farming and devoted itself to real estate, hotel industry, and etc. Sadly, the third generation, especially from the 30s on, were attracted to the ideas of social Nazism, and there was a chapter of the Nazi Party within the German colony. In 1939, where World War II breaks, all the German residents in the Holy Land are declared as enemy residents, and they are expelled from the land, from Jerusalem, mostly to Australia, leaving those wonderful houses behind them. This is the site of the community house of the Templars. The Templars didn't believe in church as itself. They believed in direct connection to God, but they did have an elected leader. So these houses, which were appropriate also for praying and conducted masses and of course and other things, was called the community center, not a church. And I want to conclude with a story that I think resembles the social reality in Jerusalem at the end of this period. And before that, I would like to say that things are already changing. As I said, the landscape is changing in Jerusalem. There's much more European presence of many sorts in the city. The fact that Europeans has a protected status in Palestine enables also a lot of Jewish immigrants to come to the city for the first time, especially Ashkenazi Jews from Europe. But again, we see that many studies on this period shows that Jerusalem as a cosmopolitan space functioned a bit differently, especially with neighboring and social relations between Jews and Arabs, which were a normal thing, especially between Arab-speaking Jews and the local Palestinians. They saw themselves in many ways as belonging to the same culture, to the same space. Things are, of course, changing with the rise of Zionism and and the immigration of new type of immigrants. If up until the end of the 19th century, Jewish immigrants were mostly religious people coming to basically to die in Jerusalem at old age out of religious sentiment. For the first time in the end of 19th century, you have Jewish immigrants which are explicitly secular, have socialist ideas, modernist ideas. Most of them do not come to Jerusalem. For Zionism, Jerusalem indicates the space of the old Jew, the space from which they run away from. Only few of them are coming to Jerusalem. But again, the rise of Zionism creates the first friction between these communities, but up until the British period, it didn't escalate into mass-scale violence. And there is still a lot of mixed and hybrid spaces of identity and everyday life. And I want to tell you the story of Alter Levin and Khalil Sakakini as a small representation of this type of sociability. Alter Levin, in the right, was a Jewish businessman, also a poet, and a very colorful person. He was the first sales person for insurance, for example, in Jerusalem. He also had one of the first private cars, a very known figure in the city. He was actually born to a ultra-religious family in Jerusalem, Ashkenazi ultra-religious family, but you can already see that some of the second generation in the beginning of the 20th century are already modern, and he was a secular Jew eventually. And Alter Levin in 1914, when World War I breaks, the Ottoman Empire is chasing after all the foreign European citizens. Anyone who had citizenship of the enemy states at that stage were expelled or sent to jail. And Alter Levin had an American passport, so he was on the run after the beginning of the war, and he went to hide in several spaces but could not find a space for himself. And then he remembered that he has a friend, Khalil Sakakini. Khalil Sakakini was actually the Arab teacher of Alter Levin. Alter Levin wanted to control better Arabic, it's good for business in this kind of city, and etc., and was interested in that. Khalil Sakakini was a very known Christian Arab figure. He established the first systems of public schools, wrote books about learning Arabic, and was also a very nationalist, in fact, Palestinian. And Alter Levin comes to his house of Khalil Sakakini in the middle of the night and knocks on his door. And he wakes up and he sees his student, and what are you doing here? I know that the authorities are looking for you. And he said, yes, I'm on a run and I need you to hide me. And then Khalil Sakakini reports about it in his diary. He says, I have a conflicted, for him, he said to himself, I have conflicting interest here. As a Christian, a devoted Ottoman, I need to bring this guy to the authorities. But as a Christian, I cannot reject this request for a shelter. And eventually, he lets him in, lets him to sleep, and gives him a room at the alley. But then Alter Levin has a problem. Although, as you see, he was a modern Jew, he still ate kosher food, and he couldn't eat anything in Khalil Sakakini's house. And so he was looking out of the window, saw an old woman that he known, and asked him, can you please bring me some kosher food? And she starts bringing him on a daily basis something to eat. But the Ottoman authorities became suspicious about this movement and followed this woman, and eventually got to the house of Khalil Sakakini and arrested them both for betrayal. And then you had this situation that both of these persons, two of them, are sitting in the jailhouse at the David Citadel of today, waiting for the trial, which could be a trial to death. And this is already at the end of 1917. And the British authorities are already coming close to the city. So what the Ottomans did was to take all the prisoners away from Jerusalem, and they took both of them by foot from Jerusalem to Damascus. And again, we can imagine this picture of the Muslim Palestinian nationalists and the Jewish poet going side by side in shackles, walking together, waiting for the trial in Damascus. Khalil Sakakini was lucky because his Muslim students pressured the authorities to release him, and eventually he manages to go back to Jerusalem. And what is interesting that when he comes back to Jerusalem, he's petitioning the authorities on behalf of Alter Levin, asking them to forgive him and to release him. Alter Levin spends a few more months in jail waiting for his trial, but eventually is released, and quite traumatized, he comes back to Jerusalem. And I tell this story just for you to be able to imagine this kind of shared neighborhood that existed in some ways in Jerusalem under the Ottoman regime. Of course, I don't want to romanticize it. There was a discrimination against Jews, and Muslims did have much more privileges under the Ottoman regime. But of course, when we get further on to later periods of Jerusalem, it would be harder to imagine this kind of reality of these two figures. And our story ends with World War I, which was a terrible period in Jerusalem. Once the war begins, the Ottoman authorities are crashing down on many communities, especially Jewish communities. They expel a lot of the population of Jerusalem. There's immense poverty at the whole end because work stops, and many people die from hunger. The population of Jerusalem is shrinking. But before the end of the war, the numbers indicate that in Jerusalem you already had close to 40 or 50,000 people, and this number shrinks dramatically during the war, and it takes the city another 3-4 years after the war just to come back from a very dire physical and social conditions that the war left in Jerusalem. In these pictures, you see Turkish prisoners of war led by a British officer in the streets of Jerusalem. And we'll get back to the war and the end of it in our next class. So, thank you very much.